The knock came at dawn. 3 slow strikes against a door that had not been knocked on by anyone of consequence in 11 years. Cassius Burke set down his coffee. Out in the gray half-light a horse stood at the gate that no plow horse ever could have been. 16 hands of blooded chestnut, with a saddle worth more than the whole Burke claim. And the man swinging down from it wore a coat that had never once been mended. In the back room, Eliza Burke heard the knock and the silence after it, and her father's chair scrape, and she did not come out, because the last thing he had said to her the night before, with the candle guttering and her 28th birthday 3 days gone, was that no man would ever come for a woman built like she was, and she had no reason yet to think the dawn would prove him wrong. If you have ever been told by the people who were supposed to love you that you were too much to be wanted, stay with me, because this is the story of the morning a father's cruelest words came undone on his own doorstep. Subscribe to this channel and stay with me to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now come back to that gray Wyoming dawn, to the richest rancher in the territory standing at a poor man's gate, and the daughter in the back room who does not yet know he has come for her. Her name was Eliza Burke, and she had spent her whole life being measured against the size of her body and found wanting by the one man whose opinion a girl cannot help but carry. Her mother had died when Eliza was 9, and from that day Cassius Burke had run his small hard claim on the Sweetwater, with 2 hands, his own and his daughter's, and had never once let her forget that the second pair of hands had come attached to a girl who ate more than she earned in his accounting. He was not a drunkard, and he did not strike her. His cruelty was quieter and more permanent than that. It came in the form of a verdict, repeated across 19 years until she wore it like her own skin, that she was too big, too plain, too much, and that he would carry her unmarried weight to his grave because no man in his right mind would take her off his hands. She had believed him the way you believe weather. It was simply the climate she had been raised in. And so she had made herself useful past the point any hired hand would have stood for. She ran the house, doctored the stock, kept the books her father could barely read, mended what broke, and grew what would grow on 40 stony acres, and she had stopped, sometime in her early 20s, expecting any of it to be seen. She had arrived at a private accounting of her own worth that lived underneath her father's, quiet and stubborn. A thing she did not show him, because showing him would only give him something to take. The man at the gate was Wyatt Holloway, and even Eliza, who knew almost no one, knew the name. Holloway ran the Crown H on the far side of the divide. 60,000 acres of the best grass in the territory. 1,000 head. A house people spoke of the way they spoke of churches. He had built it himself out of nothing in 15 years, and 4 winters back he had buried his young wife and the child that died being born on the same gray day, and had not been seen at a social or a church or a cattleman's gathering since. The story the country told about him was the usual one it tells about a grieving rich man, that he had turned hard, that the money had made him strange, that he kept to his land and his silence and would not be moved. The peddler who came through the Sweetwater twice a year had put it plainest the autumn before, sitting on the Burke porch step. Holloway don't court, and Holloway don't call, miss. Whatever softness was in that man went into the ground with his missus. Folks say he'll die up on that mountain alone, with all his money and not one soul to leave it to. He had said it like a sad and settled fact. So when Cassius Burke opened his door at dawn to find the richest man in the territory standing on his rotting step, the first thing he did was assume the man was lost. He was not lost. Wyatt Holloway took off his hat, which was a thing no man had ever done on that step, and he asked, in a low voice worn rusty from disuse, whether this was the Burke claim, and whether Cassius Burke had a daughter named Eliza. The father said that he did, with a wary suspicion of a man who cannot imagine his daughter being the object of any sentence that does not end in complaint. And Wyatt Holloway said he had come to speak with her, if she would see him, and that he would wait at the gate as long as it took, because a man did not knock on a woman's door at dawn and then make demands of her time. How he had come to know her name at all was a small thing that had grown in him for a year without his quite noticing. The autumn before, his best stock dog had slipped its rope from the back of his supply wagon as he passed through the river town, and a large young woman coming out of the mercantile had seen the animal bolt under the wheels of a freight team, and it stepped, not jumped, stepped, with a calm that stopped his heart, into the road and taken hold of the harness of the lead horse, and turned the whole team aside with the flat of her hand and the weight of her body, and had picked his trembling dog out of the dust and handed it up to him without a word about the danger she just stood in. He had asked a storekeep her name. He had carried it a year, and when the loneliness on his mountain had finally grown heavier than his fear of the world's eyes, it was that name and that calm and that unflinching strength he had ridden out at dawn to find. But that morning, at the gate, he knew none of how to say it. He only waited. Eliza came out because her father, baffled and greedy and certain there was money somewhere in this, made her. She came out drying her hands on her apron, braced for whatever new humiliation the morning had arranged. And she stopped on the step when she saw the man and the horse and the coat. And Wyatt Holloway looked at her, and it was not the long, slow measuring look she had stood under her whole life, the one that starts at the crown and travels down. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands. And he said, "You're the woman who turned the freight team in the river town a year ago this fall." It was so far from anything she had braced for that for a moment she could not answer. "I am," she said. "You saved my dog," Wyatt Holloway said, "and you didn't stay to be thanked." And then, quieter, as though it cost him, "I've thought about that a great deal." Cassius Burke, hovering in the doorway, began to say something about his daughter's usefulness, began to set a price on her the way he set a price on a heifer. And Wyatt Holloway turned and looked at him once, and whatever the rancher saw in the father's face seemed to settle a thing in him. He turned back to Eliza. "I came to ask if you'd ride out to the Crown H," he said, "and see if it suits you. I've a great house with no one in it, and a kitchen gone cold, and more land than one man can rightly hold alone. I'm not a talking man, and I won't pretend to be. But I'd be square with you, and the work would be yours to run, and no one on my place would ever say a word to you they wouldn't say to me." He held her eyes. "You'd not be doing me a small favor," she heard, underneath the plain words, the thing he was not saying, that he had come a long way at a strange hour to undo something, though he could not have known what. And she heard her father draw breath to answer for her, and she stepped down off the step before he could, the way she had learned to step into the road in front of a runaway team, and she said, "I'll get my box." The Crown H, when she saw it 2 days later from the rise above the home valley, was everything the country said, and a thing the country had not understood. It was grand, and it was grieving, which is a particular thing to see in a great house. The barns were kept like cathedrals, and the stock was the finest she had ever laid hands on, because a rich man with nothing inside him to tend will pour himself into the parts of his life that have nothing to do with the inside of a house. But the house itself, for all its size, had the look of a place its owner only passed through. Whole rooms were shut and sheeted. In the front parlor a piano stood under a gray cloth, untouched 4 winters, and in the kitchen, the great heart room of the house, big enough to feed 30, There hung a rack of fine Eastern copper and a wall of imported china, every piece of it dulled and dusted and unused, because to clean it would have been to admit that the woman who chose it was not coming back to set a table with it. The kitchen told the rest the way kitchens do. The vast range, big enough to roast for a wedding, was choked with cold grease and old ash, and a cook came in from the bunkhouse to fry the hand salt pork on one corner of it, and touched nothing else. The pantry was a rich man's poverty, sacks of flour gone to weevil, hams left to spoil, a wealth of provisions a grieving household had no will to turn into food. Eliza set her mother's bread crock on the cold range. She had kept the starter alive across 2 days of hard riding the way she had kept it alive through 19 years of her father's table, and she looked at all of it, without letting her face do a thing. And then she took off her good shawl and rolled her sleeves to the elbow, because work was the only language she had ever fully trusted. She scoured the great range to its true black iron. She threw out the weevil flour and scrubbed the pantry to the wood and salted what could be saved. She found the ice house mismanaged and the spring-fed cooling room run warm and put both right inside 2 days, which the bunkhouse cook had never thought to do because he had never thought the place was his to mend. And on the 3rd morning, in a kitchen that had not made a loaf of bread in 4 years, she baked. The smell of it went through that great shut-house like something coming back to life. It went down the hall past the sheeted parlor and up the wide stairs and out the open window to the corral. And the oldest hand on the place, a gray man named Dent who had helped Wyatt Holloway dig 2 graves on a hill 4 winters back, stopped with the bridle half on his horse and stood very still, like a man hearing a voice he had given up on. Wyatt Holloway came in from the horse barn at noon and stopped 3 steps inside the kitchen door. He did not look at the bread. He looked at the copper rack she had taken down and scoured back to fire bright and rehung, and at the steam fogging the window his wife had chosen, and for a long moment the richest man in the territory could not seem to look anywhere at all. Eliza cut the heel off the first loaf, too hot to be sensible, and buttered it and set it at his place, and went back to the range to give him the dignity of her back. She heard the chair. She heard the long quiet. When she turned, the plate was clean, and he was at the window with his back to her, and his shoulders were set the way a man sets them when something is moving in him that he is not given leave to move. "When did you last eat a meal made in this house?" she asked. It was a while before he answered. "Day before she died," he said. He had not meant to say it. She could hear that he had not. He went back out to the horses, and that night, after Eliza had gone up to her room, she heard him on the porch below her window, and in the morning the loose board on the kitchen step she had nearly tripped on twice had been pulled and reset, square and solid. He said nothing about it. Neither did she. There was a child on the Crown H she had not expected, not his, but his late wife's orphaned niece, a thin, watchful girl of 7 named Pearl, whom Wyatt had taken in after the burying and had not the first idea how to reach. The girl had grown up wild and silent around the edges of a grieving man's house, fed by the bunkhouse cook, raising herself. She watched Eliza for 3 days from doorways the way a barn cat watches, taking nothing, trusting nothing. And on the 4th day she crept to the kitchen table while the bread cooled, and she did not ask, and Eliza did not make her ask. She simply cut a small warm piece and set it on the edge of the table at a child's height, and turned away as if she had not. And when she looked again, the bread was gone, and the girl was sitting in the chair, swinging her feet. And the next morning Pearl came to the table on her own and stayed. The child accepted her 4 full days before the man let himself, which Eliza understood was the natural order of these things, and which Wyatt Holloway watched from the doorway without a word. His throat working. It was a man down in the valley who broke the quiet they had built. And it was, of all people, her own father. Cassius Burke had done his arithmetic. A daughter he had called worthless for 19 years had been carried off at dawn by the richest man in Wyoming, and Cassius had lain awake every night since multiplying what that might be worth to a clever father. He rode up to the Crown H in the 3rd week of November in his one good coat, and he stood in the grand yard he could never have dreamed his way into, and he announced to Wyatt Holloway, in front of the hands, that he had come for what was owed him. A man did not simply take another man's daughter, his property, his labor, raised at his expense, without a settling. He named a sum, and then, certain of his ground, certain of the verdict he had spent a lifetime delivering, he looked at his own daughter standing in the doorway and said, for the benefit of the rich man he assumed must already regret his bargain, "You'll learn what I learned, Holloway. There's a great deal of her, and not much worth the keeping. I'm doing you the kindness of taking her back off your hands at a fair price." Eliza felt the old verdict land the way it always had, in the soft place under the ribs that 19 years had never quite armored. And she watched Wyatt Holloway take one step, and his hand close. And she crossed the yard and laid her own hand flat on his forearm, not gripping, just resting, and said low, "He's not worth your hand, and he wants you to use it. Let him talk himself empty." The hand opened. It was the first time she had touched him, and the first time he had let himself be stopped, and neither of them remarked on it. That night the winter that had been building over the divide came down all at once, and it caught the calves in the upper pasture against the drift, and Wyatt and the hands rode out into the dark to bring them down before they smothered. Hours into the worst of it, the child Pearl, who had crept out to the barn after the man she had decided to trust, slipped on the ice of the stock pond and went through, and it was Eliza, out with a lantern looking for the girl she had counted heads and come up one short of, who heard the small cry and the crack. She did not waste a breath. She went out onto ice that would never in 1,000 years have held her, and broke through it herself on purpose, downward and forward, using the very weight the world had spent her life mocking, smashing a path to the child and getting an arm around her, and driving them both back toward the bank, with a strength no slight woman could have spent. She put Pearl up onto solid ground and dragged herself out after, and she stripped her own dry coat onto the soaked child, and carried her the 1/4 mile back through the blizzard, pressed against the warmth of her own body. And the girl lived because the woman who saved her was built exactly as large and as strong as she was. Wyatt Holloway came in from the pasture to find his wife's orphaned niece alive and wrapped and sleeping against the side of the woman he had ridden out at dawn to find, and something in his 4-winter silence broke clean through. He sat by the fire the rest of that night, and somewhere in the deep middle of it he began to talk, looking at the flames and not at her, the way he did everything. He told her about the gray day and the 2 graves on the hill. He told her about the child that never drew breath and the wife who did not survive giving it, and the way the house had gone silent around him because he could not bear to hear his own voice in it. He told her he had stopped saying his wife's name because saying it felt like agreeing she was gone. He said it low and even and terrible, and when he was done he was quiet a long while. Eliza did not tell him it was all right. She did not crowd the room with comfort to cover the size of what he had set down. She sat where she was, with her hand near his and the saved child breathing between them, and let the silence be as large as the grief was, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that says, "I am here, and this is real, and I will not pretend it is smaller than it is." Toward dawn his hand crossed the last few inches and closed over hers, and they stayed like that until the gray came up in the great window and the storm wore itself out. Her father came back on the 1st of December for his money, and he brought the law with him. A county magistrate he had half convinced that a daughter was a kind of property and a settling was owed. Wyatt Holloway gathered them all in the great hall of the Crown H. Because if a thing was to be said, it would be said in front of witnesses. The magistrate, the grey-hand dent, the bunkhouse cook, 4 ranchers, and the same peddler who had once told Eliza that Holloway would die alone. Cassius Burke laid out his claim and his sum. Smiling, certain, Wyatt Holloway stood. He was a man who had spent 4 years saying almost nothing, and the territory had built a legend out of his silence. And there in his own hall he spent his words plainly. "This woman is my wife," he said. He had not asked her, and they both knew it, and it did not matter, because it was true in every way the word was meant to mean. 2 nights ago she broke through the ice of my stock pond with her own body to pull your granddaughter out of the water, Burke. A thing not one man on this place was big enough or brave enough to do. She turned a runaway freight team off me a year before I ever knew her name. She has run this house, and healed this child, and brought this place back from the dead. And every day of her life you told her she was worth nothing. He let it sit in the hall until it was unbearable. You measured your own daughter for 19 years, and you measured wrong, and there is not enough money in this territory for you to buy back the right to do it under my roof. She stays. You'll take nothing from this house but the road home. It was the most anyone in the territory had heard Wyatt Holloway say since the burying, and it was not long, and that was exactly why it cut the way it did. The magistrate, who had a daughter of his own, put his hat back on and told Cassius Burke there was no claim here any court would hear, and that he had ridden a long way to be made ashamed. The ranchers looked at the father the way men look at a thing they are glad not to be. Cassius Burke went down off the mountain a smaller man than the legend that had ridden up it, and the verdict he had carved into his daughter for 19 years died that morning in a great hall full of witnesses, because they had all stood there and watched what she was, and there is no unseeing a thing like that. Spring came up the home valley late, and then, all at once, the sheets came off the shut rooms. The gray cloth came off the piano, and though Eliza could not play it, the child Pearl learned, and the great house filled in the evenings with the sound of a small girl picking out melodies in a room that had been silent for years. The copper hung bright in a kitchen that was never cold. Wyatt Holloway said his first wife's name easily now, and the child's who never drew breath, having learned that a beloved name is kept by speaking it, and lost only by the silence. Pearl grew tall and unafraid, and called Eliza by a word she chose herself, and in time there were 2 more children on the Crown H who would never once in their lives be told there was too much of them. Eliza Holloway baked her bread every morning from the starter she had kept alive through 19 years of a father's cold table, and the smell of it went out the great window and down the home valley, and travelers on the divide road would lift their heads at it and wonder who lived up at the head of all that grass and ate so well. The country was what it had always been, vast and old and indifferent, taking what it took without consulting anyone, putting its dead under the snow and giving back the grass each spring. But there was a great house at the head of the valley with a warm range in it, and a woman who had stopped, somewhere on the road between her father's verdict and the ice of a stock pond, asking anyone's permission to be the size she was. She had been told by the man who made her that no one would ever want her. She had lived to see the richest man in the territory knock at dawn, and a whole hall of witnesses learn her worth, and a child choose her name, and she had come to understand, at last, that she had never been too much. The world had only ever been too small, and she stayed.